to the second video about the relative clause. In this video, we are going to get to know the concept of the relative clause a little bit better. There are in fact two types of relative clauses in English, defining and non-defining relative clauses. If you feel that you first need to revise the basics of the relative clause again, go to the first video about this topic and come back later on. We are currently still dealing with section 6 of Unit 1, more specifically on page 22. Make sure that you have your notebook close to you as well. So let's get started. There are two types of relative clauses, defining relative clauses and non-defining relative clauses. Now, when you define something, you show or describe something very clearly. So this may be good to keep in mind for the rest of the explanations. To explain the difference between the two, we are going to go back to the past again with the famous girl group Destiny's Child. You see them here in the picture. They were particularly popular during the early 2000s. You might even recognize a singer that is still very popular today, namely Beyoncé. You can see her on the left side of the picture. Destiny's Child is going to help us explain the difference between defining and non-defining relative clauses. Now, if I want to describe to someone who is exactly my favorite in Destiny's Child, I can, for example, say, I think the woman who has blonde hair is the prettiest. Who has blonde hair is then a relative clause about the antecedent, the woman. In the relative clause, I give information that you really need to identify the woman that I'm talking about. There are 3 women in the picture in the girl group Destiny's Child. So if I didn't mention what hair color she had, you wouldn't know which woman I am talking about. So you really need the information in the relative clause to know which woman I am referring to. Now, because you need that information, you can't leave this relative clause out of your sentence. Also, there can be a comma at the end of a defining relative clause. So in this case, behind hair, you can have a comma, but you can't have one in front of your defining relative clause. However, I can also describe the woman that I think is the prettiest in another way, with the following sentence. A good example here is a non-defining relative clause. I think Beyoncé, who is the leader of the group, is the prettiest. Here, your relative clause is who is the leader of the group, and it gives some good additional information, but I don't really need it to show you who I am talking about. This is because I have used Beyoncé as my antecedent, and so by mentioning her name, you already know who I'm talking about. So I don't need to mention further that she's the leader of the group. If I would just say, I think Beyoncé is the prettiest, then you would still know who I'm talking about. So as a result, a non-defining relative clause you can leave out of your sentence. It is also almost always put between commas, so you have a comma in front and after the relative clause. In your iBook, you can find this scheme on page 22, and it's a very good summary of everything you need to know about the difference between defining and non-defining relative clauses. However, one more thing, let's have a look at the non-defining relative clauses at the examples. You can see here that the antecedents in the non-defining relative clauses are all what we call proper nouns, or in Dutch, eigennamen. Antecedent, the first one is, for example, John, and the second one it is Canterbury, which is a city in England. These are very specific and already exactly tell you who or what is exactly being talked about. So most of the time, these proper nouns have a non-defining relative clause because you don't need the extra information in the relative clause because you already know the exact name. Let's do an exercise on this difference. So in exercise 5, which is a widget, a situation is described to you, and you need to choose the relative clause that fits the situation. One of the options is defining, and the other one is a non-defining. Situation 1. Joanna has 2 neighbors. One of them is a teacher. She helps her with her homework. The first possible answer is actually a defining relative clause, because the relative clause is not between commas, so you can leave it out. And the second answer you have a non-defining relative clause because it is between commas and you can leave it out if you want to. Now, which one fits the situation? Joanna has apparently two neighbors, for example, the two neighbors that you see in the picture. One of them helps her with her homework, but we actually don't know which one because she just tells us that we have two neighbors. So we need to actually have some more information, namely the fact that the one who is a teacher helps her, to figure out who is exactly helping her. So we need a defining relative clause because we really need this extra information to know which neighbor she's talking about. So option 1 is therefore correct. Situation 2 is my sister is talking to 3 people, 2 girls and a boy. The 4 of them play in a band together. Again, you can choose between a defining or non-defining relative clause about the guy in the band. So the band consists out of 4 people, 3 females and 1 male, like you for example see in the picture. Now, do we need extra information to identify the guy in this group of people? Not really, because there is only one guy and the rest of them are girls. Therefore, the extra information about the fact that the guy is the drummer is not really necessary to know who we're talking about. Therefore, the correct option is 2, the non-defining relative clause, because you can leave it out and you would still know who is being talked about. Situation 3 is, I bought 2 jackets last summer, a green one and a white one. So we have a green and a white jacket, like for example you see in the picture. Do we need the extra information about when you bought it to know which green jacket is talked about? No, we don't, because we already see a difference. One is green and the other one is white. Therefore, we need again a non-defining relative clause. For example, if you would say the green jacket is torn, that would work as well. Then you would know which jacket you're talking about. So you can leave it out if you want to. Situation 4 is there are 2 boys waiting for us. One of them has a car. So we have 2 boys here. Do we need extra information to know which one of the boys is being talked about? Yes, we do, since there are 2 boys. Therefore, we need a defining relative clause with some extra information. Therefore, the first option is correct. Now, if you master exercise 5, you master the basics of defining and non-defining relative clauses. That is already great. But now we're going to upgrade it a little bit with exercise 6. In this exercise, you get 2 sentences that you need to combine into one using a relative clause. Make sure that you write down solutions in your notebook. Now, I've already given you an example. The British Museum has the largest covered courtyard in Europe. It is the oldest museum in the world. These are 2 sentences. Now, transformed into one using a relative clause, that would be the British Museum, which is the oldest museum in the world, has the largest covered courtyard in Europe. Now, what you need to pay attention to is that when you have an exercise such as this one, it's good to first decide which antecedent you're going to pick and for which you can create a relative clause. Now, the British Museum is mentioned in both sentences, so this would work as a good antecedent. Next, you need to decide what pronoun to use. Since the British Museum is an object, which would work fine here. And lastly, you need to decide after you have created your relative clause, in this case, which is the oldest museum in the world, if it is defining or non-defining. So you need to ask yourself, do you really need to know the information to know what is talked about? The British Museum is already a proper name, it is an eigen naam, so you technically do not need to know that it is the oldest museum in the world, so it's just additional information. Therefore, it is non-defining and you can put it between commas. Let's prepare 2 sentences together. Sentence 1. We go to the Lake District next week. We have holidays then. First, look for your antecedent. Now, what is actually mentioned in both of the sentences? The fact that next week you have the holidays. So I think next week could work as your antecedent. Next week is a specific moment in time, so there is one pronoun that would really fit here. And in the previous video, we have seen a pronoun for that, namely when. So as a result, we would then get, we go to the Lake District next week when we have holidays. The last step is, however, to figure out, is my relative clause defining or non-defining? Can I leave it out? And since it is next week, it's a very specific moment in time, we don't really need the extra information of the fact that you have holidays then. So it is therefore a non-defining relative clause. You can leave it out, you don't need it, so you can add a comma. Sentence 2. I know people. They own their own boat. A good antecedent here is people, since they're talked about in both sentences. Now, people are people, not objects, so a good relative pronoun to use here is who. So the result that you get is, I know people who own their own boat. Now, the last thing you need to consider, is it a defining or non-defining relative clause? Do you need the extra information in the relative clause? Well, you actually do, because if you leave it out, you get I know people, but then you absolutely don't know what kind of people they're talking about. So it is a defining relative clause, so we don't need to add any commas over here. Okay, prepare the rest of exercise 6 yourself. Then you can move on to exercise 7 and decide if the relative clauses in the text identify or just give extra information. And exercise 8 then, you will again have to create relative clauses yourself, and you also need to decide if you need to add commas or not. So, what do you need to remember of this video? There are two types of relative clauses. A defining relative clause gives information that you need to know who's being talked about, while a non-defining relative clause just carries some extra information. Good luck with the exercises, and I will see you next time in the next video.